Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this virtual conversation, and thank you so much to the Gantt Center for hosting us. I'm Dr. Emily Magash. I'm an architectural historian and the Associate Director of the School of Architecture at UNC Charlotte. I'm also the co-curator of the exhibition currently on view at the Gantt Center, Container Contained Phil Freelon Design Strategies for Telling African American Stories. Our exhibition title reveals our premise that Phil Freelon wanted his buildings to be more than a container. He wanted them to engage with the mission and vision of what was housed within, the contained. And so much of his work was public buildings that intersected with African American communities. So in preparing the exhibition, our guiding questions became, how did he link containers to their contents? What design strategies did his team use to connect architecture to the institutions for which they design? How do Freelon's buildings help tell stories about African American history, culture, and identity? Tonight, the School of Architecture and the Gantt Center have invited 3 experts to join me in a conversation situating the work of Phil Freelon and his team in broader narratives. Because generations of Black architects have explored the intersection of identity in the built environment, and historians have sought to make sense of their work. So where does Freelon's work and design strategies fit in relation to the work of others? So joining me tonight, we have Jack Travis. Jack is a prolific interior designer, architect, author, and educator whose work investigates Black history and culture and includes forms, motifs, materials, and colors that reflect this heritage. He established his namesake studio in 1985 and has completed projects for clients such as Spike Lee, Wesley Snipes, and Giorgio Armani. Jack is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and was inducted into the Council of Elders of the National Organization of Minority Architects. He founded the nonprofit Studio for Afroculturism in Architecture and Design to collect, document, and disseminate information on African American culture. And significantly, in 1992, Jack edited the seminal book, African American Architects in Current Practice, which was the first publication to profile the work of Black architects in the US. Tonight, we also have Sekou Cook with us. Sekou is the new director of the urban design program at the UNC Charlotte School of Architecture. Through his namesake studio, he experiments and examines a vast array of project types, from public, nonprofit, and residential works to mixed-use projects and tenant improvements to speculative developments locally and internationally. His current research centers on the emergent field of hip-hop architecture, a theoretical movement reflecting the core tenets of hip-hop culture with the power to create meaningful impact on the built environment and give voice to the marginalized and underrepresented within design practice. Sekou's work has been widely disseminated through his writings, lectures, and symposia, and is the subject of his monograph, Hip-Hop Architecture. He was featured in the landmark exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, recently on view at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And finally, we also have Dr. Charles Davis II with us tonight. Charles is an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University at Buffalo. His academic research excavates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and contemporary design culture. His research has been supported by grants from the Canadian Center for Architecture, the Graham Foundation, the University of Pennsylvania, and UNC Chapel Hill. He co-edited The Cultural Readers, Diversity and Design, Understanding Hidden Consequences in 2015, and Race in Modern Architecture in 2020. And he published the monograph, Building Character, The Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style in 2019. Charles's current project, tentatively entitled Black by Design, An Interdisciplinary History of Making in Modern America, recovers the overlooked contribution of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment, from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. So I'm going to pass the mic to Charles Davis now to provide a thematic introduction to tonight's conversation, and then to moderate the discussion among the panelists. Charles.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for that very generous introduction, for clarifying the purposes of the exhibit, and also thank you to the Gantt Center for arranging this talk and helping us with the technicals so that we can present here today. I'm going to start by sharing my screen with everyone, and we're going to start off with an introductory presentation, and then we'll move on to a discussion, moderate discussion, and then we'll open things up to the audience to answer questions as well. So the way I wanted to start this evening was to talk about and to start with a very basic question. What constitutes an African American architecture? Now, on the surface, this seems like to be a very simple question, but actually, as architectural critics and historians and architects themselves have debated this issue, you tend to get people coming down on several sides of this particular question. I'm going to review two different approaches with you this evening that tend to predominate in our literature. The first is a demographic approach. A demographic approach to African-American architecture tends to focus on the rate of racial and ethnic diversity and inclusion within the profession at large. And these studies present a moral critique of the racism of the profession, and they demonstrate the inherent potential of African-American achievement in the face of such opposition. We tend to look at the rates of licensure and in comparison to the rate of demographic inclusion in the United States. So currently, African Americans collectively make up about 2% of those licensed to practice architecture in the United States, although they make about 13% of the overall population. And within this kind of literature, as you can see here, I'm showing you some images from the Association for Collegiate Schools of Architecture, tracing the numbers that we have here in our profession currently, as well as certain books, including a book about Phil Freelon, which just looks at him as a dream builder and the story of an architect itself. And in this particular kind of literature, what's celebrated is the mere inclusion of Black excellence into the field. And usually this is pitched to the general public to inspire young people, particularly high school students, to think about architecture as a career as they move forward. I think there's also a different approach, a manifesto approach to architectural design by African Americans. And this one tends to examine the design philosophies behind each practice. So it's not just celebrating the fact that African Americans are included in the practice, but now it's interested in the ways that architects translate the social values and cultural practices of this racial and ethnic group into material forms. What inspires them? What kind of groups and collectives do they work with? And how do they aspire to create innovation in architectural form? And there is an entire host of books of this fashion. I'm just going to show you a few, two of which have been written by our panelists here today, including Hip Hop Architecture by Sekou Cook and African American Architects in Practice by Jack Travis. There are also books by Mario Gooden, Craig Wilkins, Darrell Fields, and Leslie Loco. And this is just a kind of sampling of what's out there. These books try very hard to develop rubrics of analysis that help us to understand what kind of movements, what kind of strategies and techniques exist within architecture itself, and even some of the departures and variations within architectural discourse. Now, in truth, we need both of these approaches in order to understand Black cultural practices. We need to understand when and why people were excluded and included, but we also need to understand what philosophical ideas drive their work. And it's a combination of both of these narratives that tells us why it has been so difficult for African Americans to work in this field. And I argue that it is because they have been forced to labor under the European origin myths of design creativity. This is a slide that I produce with my students each year when I teach an architectural history survey. I take 3 of the most dominant history surveys, ask my students to go to the index, look at the number of pages dedicated to the single architect, and define examples of that work. And what they find is interesting because they'll show first the images of the buildings, which shows a kind of formal variation. And students tend to be excited about the differences that they see in these images themselves. Different materials, different approaches, different aesthetics. But when they finally get to the people who make these buildings, there's a kind of demographic over-representation that's clearly evident, despite the many hundreds of years that are covered in this. And within this is a kind of dual mythology, a binary that tends to overprivilege European pedigrees and ideas and to underprivilege those produced by non-white individuals. And this has to do with the primitive modern binary of genius. We need to look no further than someone who celebrated as Le Corbusier in his book, When the Cathedrals Were White, to look at the ways that he celebrated Black jazz by people like Louis Armstrong, John Coltrane, and to think about the sophistication of jazz improvisation, syncopation, etc. But for him, he believed that the spirit of African Americans themselves was more intuitive than conscious and creative. And so he described them as having a simple spirit that did not match up to the depths of creativity that were involved with their music. And it was not just Le Corbusier who developed this primitivist notion of Black cultural genius, but it was also codified in other modernist institutions, from museums and scholarly books to the standards that were taught in professional schools of architecture. We can look at some of the first exhibits at the Museum of Modern Art, including the Cubism and Abstract Art Show, which segregated Negro sculpture from the machine aesthetic, categorizing both the primitive and the modern itself. Now, under this kind of reductive schema, Black architects are either forced to emulate white standards of beauty for acceptance, or they seem to be forever caught between these two polarities of the primitive and the modern in architectural theory. So when I look at Phil Freelon's work, what's really interesting is that a premise and an underlying assumption of his work is the rejection of this binary between the primitive and the modern. And I would argue that he fully embraces all aspects of Black craft, Black material culture, Black expressive culture, as bona fide elements of Black modernity. In doing so, he not only rejects the primitive categorization of Eurocentric design theory that holds Black and white material culture in opposition, but he levels the playing field and treats them as if they're equal elements. And I'm just going to use two examples from his work. One is the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Arts and Culture. And what's interesting is that there are three references that he tends to create a story or narrative from. One is the historical school, the Meyer Street School in Charlotte, that was also known as the Jacob's Ladder School because of the huge ladder in front of the building itself. This recalls the image of the biblical image of Jacob's Ladder, which is represented in several different ways, from a kind of a Euro-American or Eurocentric understanding of biblical narratives. But then the facade itself and the way that the building is organized from the inside to the outside, and the two narratives that work together, recalls the quilt making practices of African Americans. And so he's using both of these elements, European American and African American, to talk about and to construct his architectures. We can also look at his National Center for Civil and Human Rights, both looking at the story of progress within African American culture domestically, but situating it within a global narrative of human rights progress. And again, architecturally, there are elements that refer to the double lancet windows of Gothic churches on the interior of his building. And then the tessellation and the patterning of the ceramic tiles on the outside refers to different types of vernacular architectural practices, from the mud brick types of traditional constructions found in West Africa to the use of brick in decorative ways by African Americans themselves. And so I offer this as sort of a précis to understand both the innovations that someone like Phil Freelon and African American architects offer us, as well as to just give a general gloss of the kind of disciplinary language under which we have to labor in order to produce this kind of work. Now, at this point in time, I'd like to turn the mic over to Jack Travis to give him an opportunity to talk about his own creative practice and the ways that he's carved a unique path for himself within the field of architecture.
Thank you, Charles. That was a very arousing and I think appropriate introduction to Phil Freelon and his work over the last few years, a couple of decades over his life. I met Phil Freelon in 1990, and I was just blown away at the level of competence and creativity that I saw in him. I had met few Black architects in my life before then. I grew up in Las Vegas with that level of expertise. And I saw him in this incredible transition of cultural identity in his work transform. Can you go to my first slide? I thought it was very interesting that the idea of formal identity was something that was talked about in relationship in his work with many other aspects, but I posited that's a formal identity that African architects or Black architects should not back away from. So in my work, there's basically two sort of conceptual notions about space and about ideation of space. And they start with the notion of atmospheres and perspectives. Atmosphere being a place that one can find comfort in espousing a directive that is more about them than maybe even about a predominant or prevailing situation. And the perspective is what can come out of that space if that space is offered. And I think that in academic pedagogy across the nation, we don't have either of these. We don't have an atmosphere where someone like Phil Freelon or myself in transition can actually find a comfort zone. And there's not enough perspectives, broad perspectives around the idea of what architecture formality can be and should be, that can open it up for the architect, the African-American architects, such that, again, we enter the field with the kind of power that I think is hidden in plain view that we have. Next slide. I find that the African-American architect is like often 5 different kinds of personalities within the environmental design profession. We have to be the practitioner, we have to do the work, but we also find ourselves being advocates and orators and mentors and what I call the teacher-preacher, not just the teacher, but someone who has to preach the gospel, the word of the fact that we exist and that we have a certain level of power. Next. I think for me, it starts in seeking that formal dynamic. Over the last 20 years, that has been a focus of mine. And I know that it comes with a lot of controversy. In the past, formal identity has been sort of a negative, had negative impact in Western architecture even. But for somebody to just kind of focus on form and identity is always a controversy. And I would posit that it's not just about that. I think what I find in the industry is that there are so many experts that can allow me to do a good building, that what's really truly missing is a formal identity that sets the architectural expression off as a Black expression. And I am looking for that. I am looking for how that can happen, because that's what I think is going to set us apart. We've always had good practitioners. We've always had people who are good executioners. But I think oftentimes, next slide, we sort of lose an idea and a possibility of what identity can actually be. So we've done a lot of paper architecture. This is actually a real proposal for John Saunders, formerly of ABC Sports. He passed away in 2014, I believe. This was his house for his wife and 2 children in Hastings, just above Yonkers in New York City on the Hudson River. And the idea for us in this particular house was to create a vision of a compound, a modern compound, and how would that actually manifest itself in formal identity. Next. And part of, I think, looking at that identity is being able to write, being able to research, and being able to unearth a lot of information that many of us have never gotten in school. So as you said, I think I did a book in 1992. It was one of the first books on Black architects, if not the first book on Black architects, but it really is a coffee table book. I didn't want to do something very heavy. 1, because I can't do something very heavy, and 2, because it's not going to get to the readership that I'm after. And this was one of the first departures that I made around the idea of architecture and pedagogy. That I focus my work and my writings on the people who I think the architecture is meant for, the stakeholders. It's not moving. I see the book still. Okay. I also evolved 10 principles of what I call Black cultural design application, for not as a mantra for the industry or for Black architects in general, but for myself in order to do the work. And if you look at the first 4, the first 4 have to do with, again, lack of resources, which we find ourselves worldwide as Black people on this planet. The second 4 have to do with who we are as a people. Many of us don't know the depth of the potential of understanding our history and what that can actually mean for our present and our future. So spirituality, heritage, what I call duality or irony of the condition and earth-centered, earth-nurturing are just part of what we normally do. And I posit that's where the strength comes in. Strong indoor-outdoor relationship is natural, and it is already in the environmental design of many places designed by Black people for Black people. And then we are the provocateurs of intense use of color, pattern, and texture in everything that we do. Next. And so in search of that identity and formal application, I do a lot of projects that are sort of a call for resistance in a way. And so this was a proposal for a house for James Baldwin. Next. It was based on, again, the glass house that Philip Johnson designed for himself. Single male, gay, highly talented, very creative. What would the glass house be? Which is a representation of, again, opening up and letting people know who you are and becoming, coming out. And what you see next is my idea for James Baldwin. Something less rectilinear, but structurally very sound to be very, very simple as well. But again, the structure embedded not into the idea of forces and how they might come to the ground, but also in the identity of patterns and imagery that is, again, historical reference in the culture. Next. So this is my glass house proposal. Next. I teach my students in a similar fashion. I do a couple of option studios at Pratt, which is very, very relieving for me. But even in the other schools, I teach at School of Visual Arts, New York School of Interior Design, and the Fashion Institute of Technology as well. All interior design programs, because I think that that's where the true revolution is going to come from. It's not going to come from architecture. Architecture is too embedded with resistance. So if anything is going to explode on the scene from a Black identity, it's going to be probably through not even interior architecture, but interior design and decorating. So here you see an Italian male student, after taking my course, looking at what a Maasai store might be on Madison Avenue. Next. So again, taking the idea and the ideation and the sort of imagery and the formal dynamics of the stores on Madison Avenue. Next. This is Joseph Cangialosi's proposal for storefront and shop, based again on the depth of what the aspects and meanings are of the tribal group of the Maasai, to sell Maasai artifacts. Next. And other people are doing it. The artists are doing it. These are proposals for furniture for Cheryl Riley. I want to see architecture that looks like this and works. It's not that I just want it to look like this. I want it to look like this and work. These pieces work. The left piece is a bench, but it speaks to me. I think of the benches I see in the Museum of Modern Art or in the Met, and then I want to see this bench in the African Museum. That hutch or armoire, it speaks to me. Look at the legs. It's whimsical and it's fun and it's serious all at the same time. And again, it speaks. Next. Mulaney B, who's a client of mine, working on her house at the present in Brooklyn. She's done textiles since she graduated from FIT back in the late 90s. And she's unabashed about patterns and literal representation and interpretation in her work. And now she's one of the top textile artists in the entire world. She's the founder of BAD, which is the Black Artists and Designers Guild. They just did a recent virtual show house that you can go online and see. She is prolific and she is focused from the islands, from Jamaica, and very, very strong and very, very much an inspiration for me and a client. Next. Furniture of Alex Locadia for the first Batman movie of the 1980s. Again, drawing from his own cultural background and referencing, he did work for a commercial mainstream motion picture. And then look at that hutch again on the side. Where's the architecture for me that speaks like this? Where are the architects who are really stepping out and unabashedly saying, this is what we need to be doing? And we can always come back to whatever else we need to think about. But maybe there's a moment, as Philippe Stark says in his TED Talk, maybe there's a moment for design, and maybe there's a moment for something else. And that something else oftentimes can catapult design into a whole nother different place. And I think for me, it's formal identity now. Next. Or Lauren Halsey, who has dropped out of architecture school and is doing her own thing. And George Clinton of the Earthship, Mothership, Parliament fame called her the Basquiat of her time. This is an untrained young lady, highly talented, who steps out and has a different vision. And her vision starts oftentimes with sculpture, furniture, and interiors, as does Amanda Williams and Olalekan Jayofis. We're starting outside of architecture, and that's why I think that interior design is going to be the place for us who stay with environmental design. Next. So who says what architecture is? My first slide. Well, we do. And we have to have a larger voice, and we can. We just have to do it. Thank you.
Can you go back one, Charles? Sorry.
Yes.
Not ready to. Just wanted to first start by thanking Emily for the introduction and the invitation, and thanking the Gantt Center and UNC Charlotte and Charles and Jack for engaging me in the conversation. And yeah, Jack and I was saying, Jack and I have been sparring for almost 30 years now. We started sparring while I was an undergrad student at Cornell in the mid-90s, and he had just released his book and was talking about this way of practicing at NOMA conferences. And yeah, it's good to continue my engagement with Jack and continue to spar on different things. There's much more that connects us than divides us, of course. We're both, I would say that we're both have curatorial practices in a certain way. At least our books are curatorial in finding examples and practitioners of ways of thinking or ways of making work that we've identified. And we're both, as Charles identified, we're both in this kind of manifestos side of the coin in how do we determine and define African-American architecture or Black architecture or progressive architecture. I would say that where Jack talks about the vision being primarily realized in interiors, I go to the opposite end of the scale and think that the urban design is where we're going to be seeing most of the progress in this field. Hence my current position at UNC Charlotte. But you can go to the next slide. Talking about Phil. So Phil, to me, to answer the question posed by Charles, Phil to me is the quintessential African-American architect. And this is a really short piece that I wrote, a kind of reaction piece that I wrote back in 2015, when it was still being debated who would design the Obama Presidential Center. And at that point, it was a kind of foregone conclusion that David Adjaye was going to design it because, we have a Black president, this is a Black architect, of course he's going to do it. But at the end of this piece, I make arguments for several other people, including Phil Freelon, who I clarify here was probably more and had a longer involvement with the Smithsonian Museum that is often attributed to Adjaye than Adjaye did, right? So and he's definitely more authentically African-American, let's say, than Adjaye, who is a self-proclaimed Ghanaian British architect. And of course, right now, the design of the whole presidential center has completely played down Obama's Blackness as a main theme of the whole center. So that's quite sad to see. But Phil, I think, mastered was the master of mastering the master's tool to dismantle the master's house, right? So he actually mastered all the American tools of architecture, creating really successful architecture by any standards in this context. but he also found a way, as Charles eloquently pointed out, to make it also African. So there's the balance of the Africanness of the work, the Blackness of the work, as well as the Americanness of the work. And because of that, he won virtually every important commission that was about Blackness or the African-American tradition in this country over the last 2 decades. And he then also won virtually every NOMA design award given at their conferences. There was a rumor that he literally pulled out of submitting his work to NOMA after sweeping the tables over and over again each year. And so he kind of embodied the answer to that question, what is an African-American architect? But there are deeper arguments for race, or what would make a real African-American architecture that that I like to explore more in my work. And I only have 3 slides. So the second slide is about my writing. And here in the chapter on race in hip hop architecture, I discuss the double consciousness that we're talking about. In when every time we talk about being Black in America, we have to reference this double consciousness, this duality that Phil himself was very adept at negotiating, being both African and African American. And of course, Jack just highlighted that there's 5 different people that African-American architects have to be, but we at least have 2. And so here I also quote, of course, have to quote Du Bois, who talks about this double consciousness, where he states he simply, that the Negro simply wishes to make it possible for him to be a man and simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American. And that's been quite difficult for anyone who's attempted to be either. And here I expand on the idea that it's difficult to be both Black and an architect, that requires another double consciousness because of the weighted history of what it means to be an architect in the West, in this country. And here I might make a quick reference to Michael Che's new Netflix comedy special, where he talks about the difference between he likens the American flag to, like, the relationship between Black people and the American flag is like the relationship between white people and Black people in the country. Like, we like them, but just not too many of them at the same time. We're not patriotic enough to want to surround ourselves constantly with American flags, because we know how much that means. The history of what all that means, that doesn't always include us. So if you go to the final slide, I'll make the final point, which is about producing a different kind of Blackness in architecture. So really trying to get at the answer to the question, can African Americans produce an architecture that is distinctive, that Jack keeps bringing up? But I would edit that question and say, can Blackness produce an architecture that is distinctive? And this is part of my search, and this is part of the core of what hip hop architecture is. And here I talk about, there's a kind of default whiteness of architecture, right? We have to break that notion that architecture is by default white, and that's how we've been taught. The historical precedents that Charles laid out are really all of the basis of this lineage that we think about architecture evolving. If we go backwards from postmodernism to neoclassicism and the Renaissance and Baroque back towards, and it's thinking about architecture that somehow landed across the Atlantic via England and France and via Rome and ancient Greece. Not even acknowledging that all that started in Africa to begin with, but that architecture isn't something that is as understood by quote unquote novices or quote unquote experts, is not by default something that's white. And to answer the question, we also have to think about, we have to really start to think about inventing a new canon that recognizes the distinctive modes of architectural production on their own terms, that really Black people in this context and in other contexts have been producing architecture all the time, constantly. It just isn't recognized necessarily as architecture, as quote unquote capital A architecture, by the gatekeepers, by those who are the tastemakers, who really believe and define what architecture is and is not. So my primary push within hip hop architecture is saying that architecture is produced in multiple ways, and that it has been something that has been clearly Black for quite a long time. And the way that Black people create and shape and model their environments has been very, in and of itself, has been in existence for as long as Black people have been in this continent. And I make a distinction in my book between people who are Black, but are really, really good at producing architecture through the same Western lens, versus people who are looking for Blackness in architecture, and go back to Africa primarily for their source, like David Hughes and like Jack, and people who are looking for architecture, a Black architecture right here in America, which is the foundation of hip hop architecture. So hip hop to me is one of the most authentically American products, and producing work that is what's embedded in hip hop is not just a natural progression out of postmodernism or deconstructivism. It's a whole thing onto itself. And this is how I want it to be understood. And here, this image is an excerpt of the piece that I did that was in the Museum of Modern Art in the Reconstructions project, in the Reconstructions exhibition. So I'll leave it there and say that in defining who we are and how we practice and how we produce work as Black architects, we really have to start by freeing ourselves from that colonial gaze that is always defining who we are and what we do.
Oh, that was fabulous. I really appreciate both of you guys, your explanations on both the prompt itself, but how your work satisfies this. I have a million questions, but for the sake of time, I'll limit it to one. What I see in both of your work, which is really interesting, and even comparing someone like a Phil Freelon, a Max Bond, others who I think took a more hegemonic approach to architectural form, it is in your work, I see something a bit like what Houston Baker identifies in his book on the Harlem Renaissance, where there's an identification of a unique form of modernity within Black subjectivity that needs to be recognized, acknowledged, and explored. And by doing so, there's a recovery of previously denigrated categories. I would say in Jack's work, it's sort of like the African craft tradition, even this idea of moving from the building to the interior. And then with Sekou's work, I can remember from my own studios in the 90s and early 2000s, the denigration of hip hop culture, that it's not a real culture that has an aesthetic that is synonymous with architecture. But then you move also from the building to the urban. And so there's both this kind of like recovery of the denigrated in a way, especially for Jack's work, I'm constantly reminded of Anne Chang's book, Second Skin, where she's looking at both the tattooing of the Josephine Baker house, but not from the perspective of Loos, the hegemonic speaker, but from the perspective of Josephine Baker and the ways that she's able to use the polyvalence of Blackness to both reify when necessary the hegemonic lens, but to be subversive at the same time. That there's a kind of subversion in recovering the so-called primitiveness of Blackness in this kind of context, but treating it with the dignity that it requires and deserves, as opposed to treating it as an underside category. And I see in Sekou's work the same thing in hip hop architecture, this kind of understanding the cultural genius that is there in that work. Now, there's a whole lot of comments to be made about African diasporic work versus African American work, and so I don't want to go there, but I'd love to just get your comments on, do you see yourself as sort of recovering the denigrated elements of Blackness and rehistoricizing it? Or do you think of yourself as sort of constructing a new historiography entirely? That the historiography that we've inherited is a kind of false narrative and something else has to be put in its place. And part of the design effort is to think about what that canon might be, what its sources are, you know, how does it produce certain types of aesthetic productivities that are missing from the hegemonic lens.
Jack?
I'm very excited about all of the discussion. And I think for me, it really is about production and producing, and this idea of intuition, which has again been sort of given a negative sort of pass from Le Corbusier forward. I think I want to go back and I want to recoup the idea and notion of intuitive, the idea of primitive, and restructure those around a possible future, and by doing. One of the architects that, there's a couple who really excite me, is Toshiko Mori and her offering for the Eastern Province in Senegal, the art complex and the teachers' residence that she did. And so after I saw those two buildings, I thought instantly, that's what I consider to be a Black aesthetic. And this woman is, of course, not Black, she's Japanese, American born Japanese. And then I heard her speak to Nader Turani, who is the dean at Cooper Union, who was at MIT earlier. And I know Nader as well. And her work got him to think about his departure, his disconnect from his Middle Eastern roots and the work that he had been doing over the last 20 years. And if you go on YouTube and you listen to that presentation and his introduction to her, and then his 3 questions after, and if you know Nader, each question is 5 minutes each, right? But in those 3 questions is really kind of the source of where I'm at. And that is, what have I lost? What have I forgotten? And what do I need to bring it forward? And to me, that is an intuitive and less conceptual analysis as far as I'm concerned, not as far as what Black architects need to do. And so my 10 principles, I think, really kind of touch at the root of that. The first 4 have nothing to do with architecture, because we can't talk about architecture first. We cannot. We have to talk about the lack of resources and the idea of maintenance, for instance, and the idea of simplicity and ease of construction. Those are things that in a Black school, in my opinion, they need to be at the forefront, even over design studio. And see, that's a hard thing to sell, just like formal identity. And I'm totally convinced that that's what's missing. We have everything else, as Sekou said. If you look at the way that we have been practicing in the diaspora and on the continent, we have everything else. What we don't have is a legacy of architecture. And it stopped in North Africa, right? And what we celebrate as North African is the Arabs coming back into Africa and fusing with the people still coming up from the South. But before Egypt was Kemet, Kush, and a number of other of these great places. And I think for the African Black architect, or the person who identifies as Black, who is in design as an architect, you have to look at the continent. Now, you can look at what we've done outside of the continent. And I think that there's possibility, as Sekou's doing, for something to happen there. But I think the biggest explosion is going to be, number 1, with an African root, from the continent, because there's so much energy. There's so many of us. And if we all connect, it's even just going to be greater. And number two, it's going to come from interior design, I think even before urban planning, because the number one principle is economy, right? And when the scales get big, too many eyes look in. There's too much power going on. Yes, maybe urban planning before architecture, because architecture is just that big of an issue in white society. You talk about hegemony. I mean, you know, the control of architecture and architecture form is embedded in power. And to dismantle that power and to create a new architecture, an architecture that comes from an other, particularly a Black aesthetic, is not an easy task. What happens in places like Harlem and in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, is that people are changing their interiors in their brownstones. They're changing their interiors in their townhouses. They're buying small apartments and co-ops and condos, and then they're taking rentals and public housing, and they're Afrocentric on the interior, and oftentimes without architects. That's where it's happening, and we don't look. And I'll say one other thing. If formal identity can happen in two places and catapult for us, and that is in the design of churches, maybe even mosques, but certainly in the design of churches, which is prolific in our neighborhoods, and also in the ideation and the identity of our monuments and our sacred places and our high places of education, cultural centers. And we're not yet charged with taking that because we don't have the resources, the economy, in order to control that the way that we will need to. So these are big tasks. And I think we need Sekou, we need Hugh Charles, we need all the kind of different ideas. But I would just say that my take is less intellectual and it's more of a sort of a grassroots crowd directive.
Yeah, I'd say first to answer the question, Charles, I think my approach is more of a recovery approach, because it starts with, you know, I'm not as interested in repairing reputation, because you know, we have to keep proceeding with confidence without being apologetic about any aspect of who we are or how we operate. But we're recovering a notion of that the way that we occupy and exist in space is not criminal, right? Like most of how we've worked to shape spaces has been criminalized in one way or another. You know, the stoop is something that's so prevalent in any aspect of anything that people talk about, where they're talking about African American architecture right now, because but the way that we have occupied the stoop has been called loitering, or if there's like 3 or 4 or more Black men on the corner, that's there's reasonable suspicion, you know, they're possible gang members. So there's a recovery project there to understand that the way that we have been shaping and reshaping spaces is legitimate and not criminalized. And but at the same time, there is a construction project that is saying that we don't really require some level of sign off from any entities to legitimize this. You know, I talk quite a bit about legitimacy and the relevance of legitimacy in the hip hop world and in the architecture world in my book as well. But yeah, I think this is something that has to keep changing and evolving and happening on terms that don't require traditional architectural lenses of reading, don't require traditional critics to validate, but are essentially changing spatial experiences that we read and we feel and we understand. And anybody going into a space can read this as a space that is designed, has been architected, but is also a space that is distinctively Black. And some of that has to do with programming, some of that has to do with culture. But again, this is where my views and Jack's views depart. That one, the project of the interiors to me is much more of an aesthetic project than a spatial project. And as Craig Wilkins keeps writing, space is the primary medium of architects, right? And when we go out into the urban environment, that's where we see space really defining itself much more broadly, not just as public space versus private space, but territories. Like, what are the different territories that we occupy and how are they occupied? In terms of policy, I know Jack said urban planning instead of urban design, which has more to do with policy than design, but policy still is something that we have to, as designers, be much more fluent in, so that we can understand how to use those tools to shape our environments in more powerful ways that go beyond the lack of resources, minimal resources. Change can actually happen on a larger scale without the specific resources to design a singular building or a singular house, right? So these are aspects that are really important, and it's difficult for me to really fully digest the Toshiko Mori project that Jack brought up. I don't know if this is if I have time or space to get into that right now, but there is something I'll talk about an experience just from today, just from a few hours ago, being here in Knoxville, Tennessee at reviews where there is the site in Chattanooga for a low-income housing community, a building that's really important to the community that used to be a school, has been vacant for 20 years, and they're talking about transforming it and the methods of transforming it. But it's also a comprehensive design studio. So, it was tough for me to give any really useful feedback for a class with 100% white students in for a jury that was besides me 100% white, to talk about how to design for Black joy and Black excellence in Chattanooga, Tennessee, right? Like, and still also critique their wall details and their egress plans, right? So I don't know if this conversation is a conversation that I can properly have, because these are things that me and my colleagues are continually grappling with right now, and somehow it always defaults to program. It's like, okay, we're gonna design it the same way, but we're gonna call this a community center, and we're gonna call this a museum for Black art, and we're gonna call this an education space for upliftment, but it looks exactly the same. The way that it's operating, how we design it, the methodologies that we use to design these things is what's gonna transform that space. And it doesn't have to specifically conform to anything that we understand as architectural ways of producing buildings. And it also doesn't have to look like an aesthetic representation of what we know to be African. I think there's a middle ground, and it still to me comes back to hip hop, which is this ultimate methodology of collage, of taking what we have, taking all the resources, all the things that we've learned in architecture, in American culture, in American music, in American dance and theater, but through a definitively Black lens. And it's right here, it's right in our backyards. We don't have to go 400 years in the past. We don't have to go 4,000 miles off the coast.
So for me, this is really fascinating as an architectural historian, because when I listen to both you and Jack's comments, I hear a sort of inscribing of the differences and the subtleties and the various strategies and techniques. But sitting at a distance from that a little bit, I actually also see the continuities. And it makes me think of the work of Mario Gooden, his book, Dark Space. It makes me think of the work of Tara Dudley at UT Austin, who's really looking at the ways that Black master builders had a sophistication with space, especially Haitian freed people of color coming into the US, building shotgun houses and other things, who also trained with licensed architects, people like Benjamin Latrobe and others. And there's a kind of subtlety in the ways that they understood the connectivity between interior spaces, the space of the home, domesticity, but also public space and the presentation of the Black body in the public sphere, especially the freed Black body in the public sphere, and the rejection of these notions of loitering and the lawless body in space, the celebration of the lawfulness of the Black body, both to take space for themselves privately and publicly, I think connects a whole host of modalities that privileges space in the making and the shaping of the built environment, and makes the architectural work really a frame for what is happening. And so to me, there's a kind of continuity in the spatial sophistication that you're asking architects to have that allows them to be much more sensitive to these minoritized environments, but also I think creates the backbone upon which a kind of long history of Black architectural thinking from the quote unquote pre-modern to the modern, and across that time span. So I get really excited when I hear you both actually sparring about the usefulness, productivities, and sophistications of space, because then it lends a kind of a counter history of the architectural canon to me that I think when you take Blackness seriously for its productivities, its joyfulness, as opposed to its abjectness within the Enlightenment discourse, I think it matters a lot. I just wanted to sort of bring that back so that to help people appreciate both the particularities that we've appreciated in some of the architectural practices that we looked at, but also some of the continuities between them. And I think this is really embedded in the exhibit that's at the Gantt Center. So I'm hoping this is just the beginning salvo of more to come, and that we get more conversations like this one so that we can start to think about this in broader and collective terms. But I just want to wrap our conversation up and say thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Sekou. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Emily, for all the work you've done here. And again, thank you to the Gantt Center for hosting such a fruitful conversation. We hope that you'll join us again.
Thank you.
Thank you.